Well, I think it's fair to say that this morning's passage is not a passage that any preacher looks forward with glee to preaching on. The topic this morning of adultery, divorce and marriage is an issue that Jesus makes deeply personal to every single one of us this morning, whether we have ever been married or not. There won't be any of us this morning in this room that doesn't have regrets in the areas of sex and relationships. And I certainly do not stand before you this morning wagging the finger or standing above reproach. I stand alongside all of us this morning as someone that is deeply aware of my own personal failings in this area. This is a passage that I would deeply love to jump over and jump on to the next bit in the Sermon on the Mount. In fact, I confess there was a little bit of me that was tempted to give this to Ray Porter, who's coming next week to preach instead of me. But I quickly decided against that in a moment of being good. But if we want to be faithful followers of Jesus, then we must, no matter how difficult it is, listen to what Jesus has to say here. So what does he say? Let's look together at it now. Do turn, if you've got a Bible near you, to Matthew chapter 5. And let me read again those first two verses 27 to 28. Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery,' but I tell you, anyone that looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." This past week, you may well have seen on the BBC website, the BBC ran an article with a headline, "Children as young as 9 exposed to pornography." The article went on to say that a recent study revealed that a quarter, 25%, of current 16 to 21-year-olds first saw pornography on the internet when they were at primary school. The study also said that 50%, 1 in every 2, of 13-year-olds has been exposed to pornography. We live in a society that is saturated in sex and sexuality. We live in a society that believes that what Jesus says here in this passage is outrageous, offensive, downright dangerous. It's a society that says, what business is it of yours what I do in my bedroom? What business is it of yours what I think in my mind? But Jesus says very clearly here, our hearts and our minds matter to God. And we know this, don't we? We know that. How many careers, ministries, families have been destroyed irreparably because of what Jesus talks about here? Sexual sin. Let's be clear on what Jesus is saying in these verses. He's warning each of us against lust. He is not outruling the appreciation of beauty. Beauty is a wonderful gift of God, both in the world, beauty in the world, and beauty in humanity. Good gifts of God. God has made men and women beautiful in their own ways. And the Bible tells us that sex itself is a good gift of God to be enjoyed within the confines of a marriage between a man and a woman for life. What Jesus is doing here is refusing to allow ourselves to think that just because we haven't committed adultery bodily, we are somehow still living a pure life. Our thoughts and our minds and our feelings matter to God. Jesus is speaking here about lustful thoughts about others. He's speaking about those times when we allow our minds to wander and our imaginations to run wild, when we commit adultery in our hearts. He's not saying that these are equal sins, adultery and lust, in the same way that last week Jesus wasn't saying that murder and anger are equal sins. Actions are always far more damaging than thoughts. But his point is that our thoughts also matter to God. Jesus is calling us to radical purity here. Elsewhere in the New Testament, Paul will write to the church in Ephesus in the letter to the Ephesians, and he will say to the church, "Among you there must not even be a hint of sexual immorality." Not even a hint. Our actions, our words, our thoughts, our feelings matter. We are to be pure and holy. And this is just so radically different from our society, isn't it? It's so radically different. But it was also radically different from Jesus' society. For the disciples, hearing this in the first century would have been like a bombshell going off in the Greco-Roman world. A radical calling to holiness in our relationship to others. I mean, the early church struggled with this just as much as we do today, 2,000 years later. Just read Paul's letter to the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians, and see how much the church struggled with this stuff. But this matters so much to Jesus that he says what he says next in verses 29 to 30. Let me read those. "If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. If your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell." Those are some vivid and horrific verses. Let's be blunt. So why is Jesus so graphic here, talking about eyes being gouged out and hands being cut off? Well, he's not speaking literally. He's not saying do this literally. He's not saying if you find yourself continually looking at, dwelling at that woman or that man or a website or a picture, gouge out your eye. But he is saying take drastic action. Take drastic action. He's using this language because he wants us to understand that we need to be this radical in our pursuit of holiness and purity. Let me be frank. Jesus is clear here that being unrepentant in this area will only lead to God's judgment and condemnation. I would be less than loving if, like Jesus here, I didn't share that with you. So what could verses 29 to 30 look like for us? How can we strive for purity in this area? What does gouging out our eye or cutting off our hands mean for us? I'm going to give some ideas. None of these ideas are scriptural commands. They're wisdom calls. And for each of us, they will mean different things. I have no right to stand here before you and command anything that is not found in Scripture. So I'm going to be very clear. These are not scriptural commands that I'm about to share. They are wisdom calls that we need to work out. Would this be helpful for me, personally, in this area? Does it mean making sure that we stop watching certain programs because we know that we really find them unhelpful? Does it mean that I will stop taking my phone with me to certain places because I know that I will be tempted? Does it mean that I make sure that my computer or my TV is always in a public space rather than in a bedroom? These are just ideas of what it might mean today to gouge out the eye or cut off the hand to ensure that we take drastic action to live pure lives. The point is, Jesus wants us to be radical in our striving for holiness and purity. So, is there something you need to do to grow in holiness in this area? That was verses 27 to 30. Having looked at half of this passage, I am really tempted to stop here. But as hard as it will be, I do want to say something also on verses 31 to 32. And Jesus is teaching here on divorce. As I was preparing for this sermon and studying for it, I read a number of commentaries, and one of them was by John Stott. John Stott is a minister, no longer alive. He's gone to glory of a large church in London, and he wrote a number of commentaries on all sorts of books of the Bible, and he wrote one on the Sermon on the Mount. And on these verses, he wrote this: I confess to a basic reluctance to attempt an exposition of these verses. This is partly because divorce is a controversial and complex subject, but even more because it is a subject which touches people's emotions at a deep level. There is almost no unhappiness so poignant as the unhappiness of an unhappy marriage. Although I believe God's way in most cases is not divorce, I hope I shall write with sensitivity, for I know the pain which many suffer, and I have no wish to add to their distress. Yet it is because I am convinced that the teaching of Jesus on this and every subject is good, intrinsically good, good for individuals, good for society, that I take my courage in both hands and write on. I found that really encouraging as I read this. And so, mirroring what John Stott writes there, this morning I take my courage in both hands and I speak on these verses. Verses 31 to 32. Jesus says, it has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you, anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality makes her a victim of adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. We see here Jesus' view on marriage, and specifically its permanence. Jesus teaches here and elsewhere that marriage is the union of one man and one woman to the exclusion of all others for life. And the question is, why does Jesus teach that? Like all of God's commands are not random or arbitrary. Think about the Ten Commandments for a moment. Think about God's commandment, do not murder. That's not just a random command. It flows out of the very being and nature of who God is himself. God is the source of all life. Therefore, God says, do not murder. Think about the commandment, do not bear false witness. God is the source of all truth. And he is utterly faithful. Therefore, he says, do not bear false witness. God commands us to be generous because he himself is the generous God. Do you see how every command that God commands comes from his very nature? And the same is true here of marriage. God created marriage like this because that's exactly who he is. God is the God who is utterly faithful to his people. We know, don't we, from the whole storyline of the Bible that God uses marriage as a picture of his relationship with his people. Jesus is the bridegroom. The church is his bride. And Jesus comes to his bride to win her on the cross. And he binds himself to her for all eternity. And ultimately, that's what we see here. Jesus is trying to convince us of, trying to tell us of a better story. A better story than the world wants to tell us and convince us of. And he wants to invite us into this story, to follow him into it in faithfulness and purity. These are challenging verses for every single one of us. Perhaps they're some of the most challenging verses for our society at this time. And so as I finish, let me finish simply by praying that by God's Spirit we would have the power to put them into practice. Let me pray.